The signal came in broken, not the kind of broken where you tap the equipment and it fixes itself, the kind of broken that sits in your stomach like swallowed glass and makes you go very, very still. I was 3 hours into a double shift when it hit our receivers, Sergeant Dara Vass. Forward listening post Kepler Station 9. My coffee was cold, my boots were wet. The translator unit was doing what I had started calling its dramatic pause routine, which meant it was either processing something enormous or it had once again decided to have what Corporal Pete Garrow called a full-on existential episode. It was not having an episode. Vass, said Garrow from across the console, not looking up, you're staring at the readout like it owes you money. It might, I said. He finally looked up, saw my face. Stop talking. The signal was VRETH, that part was not surprising. The VRETH had been broadcasting at us for 4 years, orbital bombardment coordinates mostly. Surrender demands that our command structure had been rejecting with increasing creativity. Once early in the war, a transmission that our linguists believe translated roughly to you are embarrassingly small. And we find this offensive. We had rejected that one too. But this transmission was not a bombardment coordinate. It was not a demand. The translator unit cycled through its verification pass 3 times, which it only did when it was genuinely uncertain, and then it spat out a partial string on the main screen. Flee. That was the first word. Just that one word hanging on the screen, while the rest of the translation buffered. I pulled up the signal origin on the secondary display. It was coming from the VRETH command fleet, not a scouting vessel, not a relay buoy. The command fleet, the same collection of ships that had reduced New Carthage Station to a debris field 18 months ago, the same fleet that our admirals referred to in briefings using words I will not repeat here. Flee, flee now. The second line came through. Something has followed us here and it will not stop when we are gone. I sat with that for a moment, the kind of moment where the room doesn't change, but something behind your eyes does. Garrow read it over my shoulder. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Get Lieutenant Hale, I said. Already moving, he said. I kept my eyes on the screen, outside the station's viewport, which was scratched and slightly fogged at the lower left corner from where Private Win Colby had thrown a boot at a Spider 3 weeks ago. The stars sat where stars always sat, still, indifferent. The VRETH fleet was out there somewhere, invisible at this distance, holding its position in the dark between us and the outer belt. Holding position. I pulled up the tactical overlay. Something was wrong with the numbers, and it took me 4 seconds to figure out what. The VRETH fleet had not moved in 3 hours and 14 minutes, no orbital adjustment, no weapons charging signatures, no communication traffic between their vessels, which was the kind of silence that a fleet that size did not produce. Naturally, they had gone quiet. Not strategic quiet, not the quiet of something planning, the quiet of something listening. Lieutenant Hale came through the door at a jog, half her uniform still unzipped, hair pulled back with what appeared to be a piece of wire. She was 29 and had the kind of competence that wore no decoration. She looked at the screen. She looked at me. She looked at the screen again. When did this come in? She said. 11 minutes ago, I said. Translator. Took its time. Is it verified? 3 verification passes. It's verified. She pulled a chair and sat down, which told me she needed a second. Hale did not sit down during active situations. Sitting down was her way of making her brain do something uncomfortable at a pace it could handle. Something followed them, she said. Not a question, reading it back aloud the way you repeat a math problem that came out wrong. That's what it says. Followed them here to our system. That's what it says. And it will not stop when they are gone. She paused. That's not a threat. They're not telling us they'll leave a weapon behind. They're telling us whatever this thing is, it doesn't care who started what. No, I said, it won't stop when they're gone. It'll just keep going. The room held that for a moment. Outside the viewport, the stars stayed still. Garrow came back in with a mug of something hot and handed it to Hale. Without being asked, which was the most emotionally intelligent thing I had ever seen him do, she took it without looking at him. Private Win Colby had come in behind Garrow and was now standing at the edge of the room reading the screen. Colby was 22 and had joined up 11 months ago from the Ganymede agricultural sector. She had a habit of stating the obvious with such calm precision that it occasionally felt like wisdom. They're scared, Colby said. Yes, said Hale. The Vreth are scared. That appears to be the situation. Colby looked out the viewport. Of what? Nobody answered that because the answer was sitting right there on the screen. And none of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Something had followed the Vreth across whatever distance they had crossed to get here. Something that the Vreth, who had ended 3 of our colonies without noticeable effort, whose snorts had weapon systems our engineers still could not fully model, who had looked at humanity and apparently decided we were a minor inconvenience they would deal with at their leisure. Something that all of that had run from had followed them here to us. I pulled up the fleet telemetry again. 3 hours and 17 minutes since the Vreth had moved. 3 hours and 17 minutes of silence from a fleet that had never, in 4 years of war, been silent. They stopped firing, I said. Hale looked at me. 3 hours ago, I said, before the transmission, they stopped firing and they stopped moving and they went quiet. And nobody flagged it, she said. Command probably thought it was a tactical pause. It wasn't a tactical pause. No, I said, I don't think it was. Hale set down the mug. She stood up, which meant her brain had finished doing the uncomfortable thing and had arrived at a decision. She looked at the screen one more time at those 2 lines, sitting there clean and unambiguous. Flee, flee now. Something has followed us here and it will not stop when we are gone. I'm going to wake up command, she said. Vass, I want a full signal log. Everything the Vreth have transmitted in the last 72 hours, every burst, every carrier ping, every piece of traffic between their ships. I want to know when they first went quiet, and I want to know if there was anything in their communications before that. Anything that looked different on it, I said. She walked out. Garrow started pulling logs. Colby stood at the viewport for another moment, looking out at the dark, and I noticed she had her arms crossed in a way that had nothing to do with cold. I started pulling the signal archive. 72 hours of Vreth communications. It was going to be a long night. 4 hours later, I found the anomaly. buried in the traffic from 49 hours. Back one burst signal internal breath. Fleet frequency that the translator had. Initially flagged as low priority. Chatter and filed away. It had not been chatter. When the translation finally came. Through it was 3 words. It found us. That was it, no context, no explanation. Just those 3 words transmitted at high urgency between 2 breath command. Vessels 49 hours ago, right before the entire fleet had gone from active war. Posture to complete silence. I stared at the translation for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Hale and made another cup of cold coffee and sat in the quiet of the station and thought about the fact that the Vreth had been scared for 2 full days before they bothered to warn us. And I thought about what that said about how much they valued our opinion on the matter. Well, I thought, that is a thing. 7 years of war has a sound. It is not what you expect. It is not explosions and alarms and people shouting orders into headsets. It is the sound of people who have stopped being surprised by anything. Flat voices, efficient movement, the specific silence of a species that has compressed grief into a background hum and learned to work around it. I had been listening to that sound for most of my adult life. The counteroffensive launched on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because Garrow had just lost a card game to Colby for the 4th time in a row and was making the face he always made when he lost to Colby, which was a face that suggested the universe was fundamentally unfair. Command had embedded me with the forward coordination team on the cruiser Aldgate. The Aldgate was not glamorous. It smelled of recycled air and machine grease and the particular staleness of a vessel that had been running continuous operations for 19 months without a proper dock rotation. I loved that ship in the way you love something that has kept you alive without asking for gratitude. The strike package was 7 years of rage compressed into mathematics. 43 vessels, 3 carrier groups support. Screen logistics tail. The kind of force that our grandparents would have found unimaginable in our parents had spent their lives building toward. Commander Gil Reston, who ran coordination from the Aldgate's forward bay, described it in the briefing with the careful language of someone who had learned not to be dramatic. We have numerical advantage, positional advantage, and the element of coordinated timing, Reston said. He was 51 and had the quality of a man who had been formed slowly by difficult things. We execute the strike plan. We hold formation discipline. We do not chase. The last point was repeated twice. I understood why 20 minutes into the engagement, the Wraith were not fighting back. This needs a moment to sit properly, because it sounds like good news, and it was not good news. When a superior force stops fighting back, there are 2 possibilities. The first is that they have given up. The second is that they have a reason. The Wraith did not look like they had given up. They looked like a species doing rapid, careful math about which direction to run. I was watching the tactical display from the coordination bay when the first Wraith vessel broke formation, not toward us, away. Hard burn, no weapon signature, no communication, just a ship the size of a city deciding it needed to be somewhere else immediately. Then a second, then the entire left flank of the Wraith fleet began a movement that our tactical algorithms could not initially classify because they were built to recognize attack patterns and retreat patterns, and this was neither. This was flight. There is a difference. Retreat is organized. Retreat has a plan. Retreat preserves fighting capacity and pulls back to defensible ground. What the Wraith were doing had no plan in it. It had urgency in it, the kind of urgency that overrides everything else. "Why aren't they engaging?" said Lieutenant Commander Paul Finch from his station to my left. Finch was 36 and had spent his career studying Wraith tactical behavior. He had written 2 papers on Wraith fleet doctrine. He was looking at his display with the expression of a man whose papers had just become irrelevant. "They're not interested in us," I said. He looked at me. "They're not running from us," I said. "We just happen to be between them and where they want to be." Reston crossed the bay and stood at the main display. The Wraith fleet's movement was becoming more coherent now, which was strange. Coherent in the way that a flock of birds becomes coherent when something large moves through them. Individual panic organizing into collective direction, not because of leadership, but because they all wanted the same thing, which was to be somewhere that was not here. "Maintain strike pattern," Reston said, because that was his job and he was good at his job. Our ships kept firing. The Wraith kept not responding. It was, I thought, the strangest victory in human history. We were hitting them, and they were absorbing it, and they were not turning around. Reston's tactical team started calling out impact confirmations, hull breaches on a Wraith destroyer, drive damage on what appeared to be a supply vessel, real damage, real confirmed damage on a fleet that had spent 4 years being mostly unreachable, and none of it mattered to them because they were looking at something behind them. I know that is not literally what was happening. I know they were running sensor sweeps and receiving telemetry and doing whatever it is that Wraith command structures do when they are making decisions. But the feeling on the tactical display was of a fleet that had its attention somewhere we could not see, and we were a complication they had decided to accept in exchange for movement. Then the dreadnought moved. I need to be specific about scale here. The Wraith Command dreadnought was not a large ship. Large is what you call something that fills a hangar bay or a shipyard. The dreadnought was large in the way that geographic features are large, the way a mountain range is large. When it appeared on our sensors during the early months of the war, the first response from our analysts had been a measurement error flag because the numbers did not fit any category. They had. That ship folded its engines and ran. No weapons, no communication, no last stand. It simply oriented itself away from the outer sensor boundary and burned at full capacity in that direction, and the rest of the fleet came with it the way water follows a drain. And within 40 minutes the entire Wraith force was moving away from us at a speed that our ships could not match. Commander Reston stood at the main display and watched them go. "Pursuit is not viable," said Finch, reading the numbers. "No," said Reston. "We should call this a victory," said someone from the back of the bay. I did not see who said it. The voice had the slightly uncertain quality of someone who is not sure the word fits but has been taught to use it. Reston did not respond to that. I was watching the outer sensor boundary, not the Wraith fleet, the boundary itself, the edge of what our instruments could read out past the outer belt where space went from map to theoretical on our charts. The readings at the boundary were strained. Not wrong, not malfunctioning, strange. In a very specific way, which was that they were becoming less. The sensor returned from that region of space was diminishing not because our instruments were losing resolution, but because there was less information coming back, as if something out there was absorbing the signal, or as if the space in that direction was becoming less interested in being measured. Finch, I said. He came over and looked at my display. He looked at it for a long time. That's not interference, he said. No, that's not a Wraith jamming system. Their jamming has a signature. This doesn't have a signature. I know. What does it have? I thought about the right word. I thought about the 3 words I had found in the signal archive. It found us. It has an edge, I said, right at the outer boundary, like something is sitting at the limit of what we can see and not moving. We watched the display together. The Wraith fleet was still accelerating away. At the outer boundary, the readings continued to diminish in that very calm, very patient way. Then at bearing 317 on the far side of the outer belt, a Wraith vessel that had fallen slightly behind the main fleet simply stopped returning sensor data. It did not explode. We would have detected an explosion. It did not broadcast a distress signal. It did not make any detectable change to its drive output or its weapon status. It was there, and then it was not there. Garrow, who had been quiet for the better part of an hour, said something very quietly from his station. I asked him to repeat it. I said it didn't even leave debris. He said. The bay went quiet, the kind of quiet I recognized from Kepler Station 9. The kind that meant everyone in the room had done the same calculation and arrived at the same answer, and nobody wanted to say it. Reston pulled up the mission log and entered the engagement summary. His snort's hands moved steadily. He was good at his job. He was the kind of officer who wrote accurate reports even when the accuracy was uncomfortable. In the field for action type, he wrote inconclusive. Colby was standing near the viewport. She had her arms crossed again. She looked at the place on the display where the Wraith vessel had been, and then she looked at the outer boundary readings. And I watched her face do something careful and internal. It's bigger than them, she said, not to anyone specifically, just putting words on the shape of what we were all looking at. Yes, I said. And they came here anyway. They didn't have a choice, I said. Something was behind them, something they couldn't face, and we were in front of them, and we were noisy. Colby turned away from the viewport. Her face had settled into something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, and sat in the uncomfortable space between them. I pulled up the outer boundary readings one more time. The edge of the diminished sensor return sat at the outer belt, patient still. Well, I thought, that is a very large thing. Nobody slept well on the Aldgate for the 3 days following the engagement. This was not new. Nobody had slept well on the Aldgate for 19 months, but there is a quality difference between the sleeplessness of a war you understand and the sleeplessness of a war that has just revealed an additional layer you were not aware of, and the second kind sits behind your eyes in a way that is hard to describe and harder to shake. Command called it a tactical pause. And GT snorts. And GT, 3 days to analyze engagement data, recalibrate fleet positioning, and assess breath withdrawal patterns. Those were the official words. The actual activity on the Aldgate during those 3 days was more accurately described as a lot of people standing very still in front of displays, speaking quietly and occasionally going to get coffee they did not drink. The breath made contact on the morning of the 4th day. I was in the signal room when the transmission request came in, not a broadcast this time, a directed, encoded, formal communication request, sent on a frequency that our linguists had spent 8 months building a partial key for, because it was the frequency the breath used for communications they considered significant. They were asking to talk. Commander Reston assembled the response team in the main briefing bay, 14 people, Finch for tactical analysis, Dr. Caroline Webb from the linguistics unit, who was 44 and wore her hair in a tight braid and had the quiet intensity of someone who had spent her career listening to things other people dismissed as noise. 3 junior analysts, me because Hale had sent a recommendation up the chain that I be included, and Reston had agreed without asking why. And then we waited for the breath to speak. When the transmission came through and Webb's team began the real-time translation, the first thing the breath said was not an apology or an explanation or a request. It was a question. Are you still in your system? Have you remained? Reston looked at Webb. She nodded. He replied in the affirmative. The response was a pause that lasted 47 seconds. In breath communication protocol, Webb had explained to us months ago, a pause of that length was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. They had not expected us to stay. What followed was 2 hours of the most painstaking communication I have ever witnessed, Webb and her team working through each exchange, flagging uncertainty, requesting clarification, building the translation in pieces like people restoring a damaged painting. The breath on the other end were clearly not accustomed to asking for things, and the way they communicated showed this. They would state facts, they would stop. They would restate the facts differently, as if expecting we had misunderstood, because surely if we had understood, we would have responded differently. The breath commander, whom I started calling 6 arms in my notes because the title Webb gave her was 11 syllables long, spoke with the precision of a being who had led large forces for a very long time. She did not perform emotion, she stated conditions. Here are the conditions she stated. 60 years ago, the breath sent a deep survey vessel into a region of space they designated in translation as the Silent Dark. This was not, Webb clarified, a poetic name. It was a descriptor. The region had no detectable stellar activity, no radiation signatures, no signal traffic of any kind. It was simply a very large area of space that was very quiet. The survey vessel sent 1 probe into the Silent Dark. 1 probe. The probe stopped transmitting after 9 minutes. 11 days later, the breath survey vessel detected something following it back toward breath space. The vessel's commander reported this was not believed, turned around to show the following object to the instruments of a full breath science fleet that was sent to investigate and was then present when the science fleet also detected the following object in, became, in Webb's careful translation, extremely motivated to leave the region. 6 arms paused here, 47 seconds again. The thing, she said, did not have a configuration, it did not have a shape that their instruments could resolve. What their instruments detected was the place where space was behaving differently, where the ordinary rules that governed matter and energy and signal propagation were present on one side and not present on the other side. And this place moved, it moved at varying speeds, it moved without detectable propulsion. It moved with what she described as no interest in the Vreth beyond the fact that they were there. It had been following the Vreth for 60 years. They had tried 4 times to confront it. Webb paused her translation here and used the word confront very carefully, and said she was not certain that was the right word, but it was the closest the translation would give her. 4 times they had brought their most capable forces to bear on the region where the thing was, and 4 times those forces had experienced what 6 arms described as subtraction. Not destruction, subtraction. Things that were there and then were not there without the intermediate steps that normally fill the space between presence and absence. After the 4th attempt, Vreth Command had made a decision. They did not fight the dark. This was the language 6 arms used, and Webb said she was confident in the translation. They did not fight the dark, they moved away from it. They survived it. This was the correct behavior for an intelligent species facing an incomprehensible threat. You did not engage, you did not stand. You moved, and you outlasted, and you accepted the cost of what you lost in exchange for the continuation of what remained. They had been moving for 60 years, abandoning space, ceding territory, letting entire regions go quiet behind them as the thing followed at its own pace. And then they had come to the edge of Vreth space and found us. They had found us because we are loud. I want to be precise about what loud means in this context, because I sat with it for a long time after Webb finished translating, and I want to make sure the shape of it is clear. We have been broadcasting into space for over 100 years, radio signals, navigation beacons, military communications, the full noise of a species that found technology and started talking and never really stopped. That noise travels. It moves outward from our system in all directions at the speed of light, getting thinner as it goes, but never stopping, never silent. The Vreth moving away from the thing in the silent dark had picked up that noise decades ago. They had monitored it, they had assessed it and categorized it and made decisions based on it, none of which were decisions they had shared with us at any point in 4 years of war. And here is the part that sat in my stomach like swallowed glass. The thing in the silent dark had detected our noise too. The Vreth had been running toward our system, not because they were invading, not because they had chosen us as a target in any meaningful strategic sense. They had been running toward our system because it was the next habitable region in the direction they were moving, and they had been running toward our noise because loud things attract attention, and they were hoping that our noise would attract the attention of the thing following them, and that the thing would find us interesting, and that the Vreth could change direction while it did. We had been the distraction. We had been the noise they were running toward. We were not the prey, we had been the bait. The briefing bay was very quiet when Webb finished the translation. 14 people sitting with the information, each of them working through the specific geometry of it. Finch put his hands flat on the table. He had a habit of doing that when he was working through something. Like he needed to feel that the surface was solid. Reston said nothing. He was looking at the point on the wall above the main display where there was nothing interesting to look at, which meant he was not looking at anything. He was thinking in the way that people who are very good at their jobs think, when their jobs have just become considerably more complicated. I looked at Colby. Colby was 22 years old and had grown up in the agricultural sector on Ganymede and had joined the military 11 months ago and had in that time been present for a number of experiences that would have broken many people and had instead given her the quality of someone who had been compressed into something harder. She said, "How long has it been moving toward us since they came into our system?" Webb looked at her notes. Based on the trajectory data 6 arms provided and the sensor readings from the outer boundary, approximately 4 months. Colby nodded. She looked at the main display where the outer boundary readings were running in a small window. In the lower corner, the diminished sensor return was still sitting there, patient at the edge of what we could see. "So it's not here for the breath anymore," Colby said. "No," said Webb, "based on what 6 arms told us, its behavior has shifted. It's no longer tracking the breath fleet. It's tracking us," Colby said. "That appears to be the current situation." Colby sat with that for a moment, and then she said, "All right." Just that, all right. Like someone who had been told the weather had changed and had decided to put on a different coat. I wrote it down in my notes, just those 2 words, because sometimes the smallest response to the largest thing is the truest one. I looked back at the display, at the outer boundary, at the patient edge of the diminished sensor return. Something enormous and old and incomprehensible had been following the breath for 60 years because they sent one probe somewhere they should not have. It had subtracted fleets. It had made entire regions of space go quiet. It had turned the most capable military force humanity had ever encountered into a species that understood at a deep and fundamental level the correct response to a thing you cannot fight. And now it was looking at us, and we had nowhere to run. I thought about what Colby had said. "All right," and I thought about the fact that she had not said it with despair or with bravado. She had said it with the flat, practical tone of someone moving to the next item on the list. That, I thought, might be the most human thing I had ever heard. The Joint Council met for the first time on the 5th day. It met in the Aldgate Secondary Bay, which was larger than the briefing room and had better ventilation, a detail that mattered because 14 humans and 7 breath representatives in an enclosed space created an atmospheric situation that none of our environmental systems had been designed to manage. The breath were impressive in person. I will say that without complication. They were tall and carried themselves with the quality of beings who had never, in their entire evolutionary history, needed to wonder whether they were the most capable thing in a room. 6 arms, whose actual designation Webb had finally rendered as fleet commander. Vrethashana stood at the far end of the council table and looked at us with her 6 secondary limbs folded at precise angles and her central body perfectly still, and she did it with the patience of someone who was here because they had run out of better options and knew it. I respected that kind of honesty, even when it came without words. The first 3 hours were spent on data. This is what humans and Vreth have in common when uncertain about what to do. With feelings, address information. Instead, Finch's team laid out the censored data from the outer boundary. Webb's team presented their full translation of 6 Arms' account from the previous day. A Vreth technical specialist who did not appear to have a name in any format our translators could handle, and so was called 17 in my notes because he was the 17th Vreth I had interacted with. Presented the Vreth 6 decades of data on the thing they had been running from. The data was extraordinary and terrible. In equal measure, the thing had no consistent mass. Reading, it had no detectable energy signature in any spectrum there. Instruments could measure what it did have was effect. Every instrument the Vreth had ever brought to bear on it had detected it not directly but through what it did to the space around it. Matter in its immediate vicinity behaved differently, not dramatically. No visible distortion, no light bending, no obvious sign that anything was wrong. Just a gradual, quiet deviation from expected behavior, as if the local rules of physics were being consulted by something that had its own opinions about them. The subtraction events, the disappearance of ships and probes and anything else that entered the affected region left no trace, no debris, no radiation consistent with destruction. The objects were simply no longer present. The Vreth had a word for this that Webb translated as removal, and she said she was fairly confident that was accurate, and the accuracy was not comforting. After 17 finished presenting 6 Arms spoke, Webb translated immediately. You now have the same information we have. 6 Arms said, we have given you everything we know. You understand what it is, you understand what it does. We ask now what your strategy is. Reston looked at Finch. Finch looked at his notes. The Vreth waited. It was Commander Reston who spoke first, and he did it in the careful way of a man making sure he was saying exactly what he meant. Our strategy is not yet decided, he said. We are going to need some time. 6 Arms tilted her central body in a way that Webb had taught us indicated processing. Then she said something that came through the translation as, what is there to decide? You know what it does to things that engage with it. The decision is the direction. This was how it started, the human problem, not the problem of the thing at the outer boundary, the problem of explaining to a species that had survived 60 years of running exactly what kind of animal they had just asked for help. Finch tried first. He pulled up our combat history, not the Vreth War specifically, the full archive, 300 years of human conflict, going back further than the space age, documented and cross-referenced. He put it on the main display and said, with the patience of a man who teaches difficult subjects, I want to show you something. He started with the categories, things that were at some point in human history considered undefeatable, things that our ancestors had looked at and said this cannot be fought, it is too large, too fast, too well armed, too organized, too numerous, too entrenched, too powerful. The list was long. He did not read every entry. He summarized the categories there were. The physical categories, natural forces, large predators, epidemic diseases that had swept entire populations. There were the strategic categories, military forces that had, at various points, appeared numerically or technologically overwhelming. There were the structural categories, systems and institutions and conditions that had seemed permanent and immovable. Then he clicked to the next screen. The list of things that were still undefeated. The screen was blank. Not because the list was empty and formatted wrong, because the list was genuinely empty. Every item from the previous list, every category of thing that humanity at some point had called invincible, had at some later point been proven otherwise. 6 Arms was very still. This is a pattern, Finch said, not a boast, a documented behavioral pattern. Across 3 centuries of recorded history, we encounter a thing that cannot be beaten. We lose sometimes, significantly, and over extended periods. And then we find a way to beat it, or at minimum to change the conditions enough that the original problem is no longer the same problem. 6 Arms said something in breath. Webb translated, you lost many of those encounters before you found your method. Yes, said Finch. A significant number of your people were removed, subtracted in the sense I described. Yes. And you continued anyway. Yes. Another 47-second pause. Why, said 6 Arms. Finch looked at Reston. Reston looked at me, which surprised me. I do not know why he looked at me specifically. I had not distinguished myself in any particular way in that meeting, but he looked at me, and I thought he was asking a genuine question, not asking me to perform an answer. So I thought about it honestly. I think, I said, because we are not very good at accepting that something is permanent. 6 Arms tilted her body again. Explain. I tried to explain that when a human being is told something cannot be done, there is a subset of the population that hears that and treats it as a project. Not all of us, not most of us probably, but enough that when something enormous and incomprehensible parks itself at the edge of our sensor range and our options appear to be run or fight, enough of us are already building a list of things to try. But you cannot hurt it, 6 Arms said. Her voice through the translator was flat and factual. She was not arguing. She was reporting a condition. We have tried 4 times. Each attempt resulted in subtraction, the resources, the vessels, the personnel removed, without meaningful effect on the thing itself. Were you trying to hurt it? Said Colby. The room looked at her. She had been quiet for most of the council session, which was appropriate given that she was the most junior person in the room by significant margin, and I think most people had adjusted to the idea that she was there to observe. She had a habit of making people adjust to that idea and then speaking when it mattered. 6 Arms turned her attention to Colby. What other purpose would an engagement have? Lots, said Colby. You can engage something without trying to hurt it. You can engage to confuse, to redirect, to create data, to do something it has not seen before and see what happens. Have you tried anything it has not seen before? 6 Arms considered this. We used our most advanced weapon systems. That's not what she's asking, said Finch, and he had the tone of someone who had just understood something. She's asking whether you've tried something your most advanced weapon systems weren't designed to do. Something unexpected, something that doesn't follow the logic of how your forces operate. An irrational action, said Six Arms. A human action, said Colby. The Vreth representatives confer briefly among themselves. It was Webb told me later, the first time in the council session, that the Vreth had conferred without including us, which meant they were discussing something they weren't sure how to bring into the shared conversation. Finally, Six Arms spoke. Your species, she said, uses vocal noise during high-risk engagements. We have observed this in our analysis of your military activities. Organized vocal noise, rhythmic patterns performed at times of maximum tactical danger. Songs, said Colby, we sing. This serves what strategic function? Colby thought about it. It makes us feel like we're doing it together, she said. Even when we're scared, it makes us feel like we're in it together. Six Arms processed this with another long pause. We do not have a concept equivalent to this, she said. I know, said Colby. You engage something that can remove you from existence and you sing. Sometimes. Because of togetherness. Something like that. Six Arms looked at the empty list on Finch's display, the blank screen where the invincible things were supposed to be. She said something in Vreth that Webb translated slowly, as if she was working through multiple possible meanings and landing on the most accurate one. You are, Webb said, a very strange species to have happened to this region of space. Yeah, said Colby, we get that a lot. The council did not produce a plan that day. Plans take time, and the kind of plan this situation required was not the kind that comes from a single meeting. But something shifted in that secondary bay. Something in the way Six Arms stood, in the angle of her secondary limbs, something that I thought, watching it carefully, might be the Vreth version of uncertainty meeting. Thing it did not know how to categorize. That evening, Finch came to find me. The signal room where I was pulling updated boundary data. He stood next to me and looked at the display for a moment. The boundary moved, he said, 2 km inward in the last 6 hours. It's patient, he said. Yes. Whatever is on the other side of that boundary is not in a hurry. No. Finch put his hands flat on the console. Old habit, we're going to have to do something it has not seen before, he said, something that doesn't follow any logic it's encountered. In 60 years of following the Vreth, it has seen every response that an intelligent species with a survival instinct produces. It's seen organized retreat, it's seen military engagement, it's seen abandonment of territory, it's seen the whole range of what a species that wants to continue existing will do. It hasn't seen us, I said. Finch was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it hasn't. We looked at the boundary readings. Together, Patient Edge still sitting. They're still waiting. I thought about Colby's face when she said, all right. I thought about the blank screen where the invincible things were supposed to be. I thought about the singing. I wrote in my notes, the thing at the boundary has met every species that knows how to run. It has not met a species that is genuinely, structurally, almost pathologically bad at it. Then I closed my notes and went to find coffee and thought about what comes next. What comes next is the hard part. But the hard part has always been where we live. The plan took 11 days to build. Not because it was complex, though it was, not because the resources were difficult to arrange, though they were, because getting humans and Vreth to agree on an action plan where the action in question violated the most basic survival logic the Vreth had operated by for 60 years required a kind of patience that I was not sure we had. We had it barely. 6 Arms agreed to provide 3 Vreth vessels for the operation. This was, Webb told me privately, an enormous concession. The Vreth did not commit forces to plans they did not understand. And they did not understand this plan. Not at the level that mattered. They understood the mechanics. They understood the positioning and the timing and the sequence of actions. What they did not understand was why do a thing that every piece of Vreth strategic logic said would result in subtraction. 6 Arms asked me this directly 2 days before the operation launched, when we were in the corridor outside the briefing room and she was waiting for her technical team to finish the calibration check. You do not believe this will remove you, she said. It was not a question. She was attempting to understand the logical basis for our confidence. We don't know what it will do, I said. Then why do it? I thought about the honest answer. Because the alternative is to give it what it wants, which is for us to leave. And we have nowhere to go. The Vreth have seeded many spaces, she said. Space can be seeded. Survival continues. For us, I said, this space is non-negotiable. 6 Arms regarded me with her central vision for a long moment. I had learned by this point that a long look from 6 Arms meant she was doing complex processing that she was not ready to externalize. You are attached to a location, she said finally. We are attached to a lot of things, I said. This creates inefficiency. Yes, I said, it does. She turned away toward her technical team and I thought the conversation was finished. Then she turned back and said, the Vreth lost our homeworld in the first decades after we detected the following. It moved through the system and our instruments detected it coming. And we evacuated. We left everything. We have not returned. I did not say anything. We made the efficient choice, she said. The way she said efficient told me everything that word was carrying. I said, I am sorry. She tilted her body in a way that Webb had not taught me. A new angle. I did not know what it meant and I did not ask. Because some expressions do not need translation. The operation launched at 400 station time, 41 human vessels, 3 Vreth, spread across a contact front of roughly 200,000 km. The boundary had moved 4 times since the council meeting, each movement small, each one patient and certain. It now sat at the inner edge of the outer belt. I was coordinating from the old gate. Again, Reston was at his station. Finch was at his. Garrow and Colby were running the signal processing. Webb had her translation team on standby for any communication the thing at the boundary might produce, because we did not know if it would communicate, and we needed to be ready if it did. It had not communicated in 60 years of following the Vreth. We hoped that was a condition, not a permanent state. We hoped that doing something it had not seen before might produce something we had not seen before. The hope was fragile. We held it carefully. The first phase of the operation was the Noise. Not weapons fire, not an approach. Noise, every vessel in the contact front. Powered its communication systems to maximum output and began broadcasting. Simultaneously. Not a signal, not a message, just sound. Structured and rhythmic, pumped into the boundary region at the highest available power. Our engineering teams had spent 3 days designing the broadcast to be as non-standard as possible, nothing that resembled known communication protocols. Nothing the thing might already have a category for. Colby had been the one to suggest music. Not recorded music from our archives. New music generated in real time by the ship systems according to parameters she had written herself, which she described as organized noise that doesn't know where it's going, which was also, I thought, a reasonable description of improvisation. The Vreth had not understood this component of the plan at all. 17 had asked, with what Webb said was genuine scientific interest, whether this was a weapon or a communication attempt or a cultural ritual. Colby had said it was all 3, which had produced the longest pause from a Vreth representative I had ever witnessed. The broadcast began. At the boundary, the sensor readings changed. Not dramatically, not the way you see in stories where the monster rears up and reveals itself. The change was small and specific. The rate of inward movement stopped. The boundary, which had been making its patient small advances, held its position. It stopped moving, said Garrow, and he said it very quietly, like he was afraid of being wrong. Confirmed, said Finch. Boundary position is static, holding for a he. Watched his display 40 seconds and continuing. Reston said nothing. He was watching. The broadcast continued, the organized noise that did not know where it was going moved into the boundary region. And we watched the sensor readings, and the boundary held still, and Reston stood at a station like a man who had made an irreversible decision and was now simply watching to see what the decision produced. Phase 2 was the approach. 6 smaller vessels, human and Vreth, together moved toward the boundary at low speed, not weapons hot, not in an attack formation, in a configuration that had no tactical precedent because Finch had deliberately designed it to look like nothing in any doctrine of engagement that the thing might have seen. It looked, he said, like a mistake, a disorganized collection of vessels with no clear intent, which meant it looked like us, honestly. And I said so, and Finch looked slightly offended but did not argue. The vessels moved into the outer boundary region. They did not disappear. The sensors returned their positions. The sensor returned from inside. The boundary was degraded, compressed, unreliable, but it was there. The vessels were still there. Contact in 30 seconds, said the approach team leader, Lieutenant Owen Barclay, over the coordination channel. He was 28 and had a voice that did not carry anxiety well, which meant his anxiety was audible to everyone on the channel, but his hands were steady on his controls. I know because I was watching his station camera feed. Steady hands, that was enough. The sensors in the boundary region began producing output that our analysis team could not categorize, not the absence of readings that had characterized the boundary since we first detected it. New readings, strange readings, data that the instruments were capturing but that did not map onto any scale our systems were designed to interpret. Something is responding, said Finch. He said it the way a scientist says. Something that surprises them, pure, unfiltered observation, the sensor. Environment inside the boundary is changing, the thing is reacting. To us or to the broadcast, said Reston. Both, said Finch, I think both. Owen Barclay's voice came over the channel again. We are inside the boundary, no subtraction events. I repeat, no subtraction events, all 6 vessels present and functional. The environment is a pause, strange. I cannot describe it better than that. Strained. Colby looked at me across the coordination bay. She had the expression of someone trying not to show relief prematurely, which meant she was showing it anyway. The strange readings from inside the boundary intensified. Our analysis team was working through the data as it came in, building models in real time, discarding models that did not fit, building new ones. The lead analyst, Dr. Ian Mercer, who was 40 years old and had the beard of a man who had stopped making non-essential decisions sometime in the last 8 months, called out interpretations as they formed. The region is not empty, he said. It has a structure. It is a very complex structure that does not match any physical model in our database. It is. He stopped. It is what? Said Reston. It is aware, said Mercer. He said it with the careful voice of a scientist, being as precise as possible. The structure responds to the presence of the approach vessels in a way that is consistent with awareness. It is not a passive phenomenon. It is active. It is observing. In 60 years of following the Vreth, the thing had never been described as observing them. It had followed, it had subtracted, it had moved through spaces they occupied, but in all the Vreth data, in all of 6 arms account, there was no moment where it had stopped and looked. It was looking now. Phase 3 was what Colby had called the unreasonable part. Owen Barclay's team, inside the boundary, began the second broadcast. This one was not generated by the ship systems. This one was the 6 crews of 6 vessels, transmitting on all available frequencies, singing. I know how it sounds. 41 human vessels and 3 Vreth at the contact front were now holding position and watching the sensors and listening to 6 crews of 24 people total, singing into an incomprehensible region of altered space where an entity that had subtracted Vreth fleets was currently observing them. 6 arms standing at a secondary console in the old gate's coordination bay, because she had insisted on being present for the operation, said something in Vreth that Webb translated as, I do not have a framework for what I am watching. Nobody does, said Colby. That's the point. The sensor readings shifted again. The structure inside the boundary, the complex, active, aware structure, moved not outward, not toward the approach vessels. It shifted internally, reorganization of whatever it was made of, and Mercer's team reported that the sensor returned from inside the boundary was changing character. The compression is decreasing, said Mercer. The degradation of the sensor return is it's getting clearer. Whatever the boundary is doing to our instruments, it's doing it less. It's opening, said Finch. I would not use that word, said Mercer, but it is, yes, becoming more transparent. Owen Barclay transmitted. The visual is changing. I can see I am looking at my viewport, and the visual from inside is changing. There is structure here. I can See edges. Describe them, said Reston. A long pause, the kind where the person is not gathering courage but is searching for accurate language. It looks, said Barclay, like the space in here is thinking. That sat in the coordination bay for a moment. Then the boundary stopped. Not the movement, the boundary itself. The defined edge between the altered space and normal space, the line that had been advancing for 4 months with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. It stopped, and it held, and after 47 seconds that felt significantly longer, it began to recede. Slowly, small movement, nothing that would register as dramatic on a broad sensor sweep, but Finch was watching the specific markers, and he reported it in real time, and his voice had a quality that I had not heard from Finch before, which was that he had no idea what word to put on what he was feeling. It is moving back, he said. Outer boundary is moving outward, 2 km 5. 10. Barclay, said Reston. Status. All vessels functional, said Barclay. No subtraction events. The environment around us is it's settling like pressure releasing. We are going to be all right. I believe we are going to be all right. In the coordination bay, people exhaled. Not celebration, not triumph. Exhalation, the sound of bodies releasing something they had been holding for 11 days. 6 arms stood very still. Her secondary limbs were in an arrangement I had not seen before. Webb touched my arm and said quietly, "Surprise, that is what that posture means. I have never actually seen a breath surprised before." The boundary continued to move outward. Not fast. The thing did not do fast, but it moved, and it kept moving, and the sensor readings from the outer belt began to normalize, and Mercer's team reported that the structure inside the boundary was changing character in ways that suggested something important was happening in there that they would need weeks to fully analyze. What they would eventually determine in weeks of analysis that I was present for, and that is a separate account, is that the thing at the boundary had encountered something it did not have a category for. Every species it had followed had responded to its presence with one of 2 behaviors. They had fled, or they had made organized efforts to stop it and failed. It had experienced both of these things many times. It had a response to both. The response was to continue. We had done neither. We had moved toward it in a configuration that meant nothing and made noise that followed no pattern it recognized, and when our small vessels entered its boundary region, they had broadcast organized sound into the structure of the thing itself, and the thing had looked at us and encountered the problem. We were not recognizable. The thing that had been following the breath for 60 years had a model of intelligent species behavior built from 60 years of observing the breath. Organized, strategic, rational, operating from survival logic always, moving away from threat always, making decisions that made sense given the information available. We had made decisions that did not make sense given the information available. And the thing encountering an intelligent species that did not behave like one encountering something that moved toward it instead of away, that made noise instead of going quiet, that sang into its structure because a 22-year-old from Ganymede thought it might be worth trying. The thing had produced something it had apparently never produced before. It had paused to look and in pausing it had stopped. Advancing, and in stopping advancing it had become, for the first time in 60 years, a defined thing, a thing with an edge. Thing that reacted, a thing that could be observed and measured and learned from. Defined things can be studied. Things can be understood. Things can be engaged with on terms that are not simply the terms of something. Advancing and everything else. Retreating. The boundary moved to the outer edge of the outer belt and held there. Reston made his log entry for the day. He wrote boundary advance halted. Engagement successful by non-standard. Method recommend continued contact. Attempts further analysis required. He wrote it in the voice of a man being as precise as possible, not claiming more than the data showed, not calling it a victory because it was not a victory. It was a beginning. 6 Arms came to stand next to me after the session ended and the coordination Bay had begun the slow, organized process of post-operation assessment. She stood at my left and looked at the display where the boundary sat, held patient at the outer belt. It stopped, she said. Yes. For the first time in 60 years, it stopped. Yes. Because of the singing. Not only the singing, everything. Together the approach, the broadcast. The fact that we did not run, the snorts fact that we moved toward it. And made noise and where I stopped. Where what? Said 6 Arms. I thought about Colby saying, all right. I thought about Owen Barclay's steady hands. I thought about Finch's blank screen and the long list of things that used to be invincible. Ourselves, I said, we were just entirely, completely ourselves, and apparently that was something it had not encountered before. 6 Arms was quiet for a moment. The Vreth have a word, she said. Finally, for a species that does not behave as expected, that creates problems for predictions. What is the word? She said it in Vreth. Webb, standing nearby, translated it carefully. The translation was, a creature that should not be possible. I thought about that for a long time. Then I went and found Colby, who was at her station writing her post-operation report with the focused efficiency of someone who was not going to process this until she was done with the paperwork, and I sat down next to her and did the same. Outside the viewport, the stars sat where stars always sat. The boundary held at the outer belt. Patient held. For now held. And from the Aldgate signal room, our broadcasts continued. Organized noise. That did not know where it was going. Noise that kept going anyway. Into the dark, into the quiet. We kept talking. We always keep talking. That is, I think, what we are.